A winter hush veils Fifth Avenue as Genevieve Lansing opens a gilded door and shatters her life in a single breath. Silk, perfume and betrayal collide beneath a chandelier that suddenly feels like judgment. By nightfall, scandal hunts her name. By dawn, a telegram from Boston tempts her escape. What secret waits beyond that train? What past refuses to stay buried? Between a city that condemned her and a man who sees her clearly, Genevieve faces an impossible choice: duty to a ruined name, or desire for a truer future. Tell us where you're listening from, and one question: what do you love most about period romances? The forbidden longing, the dazzling settings, or the courage to begin again? New York, 1895. The city was still wrapped in the last breath of winter when Genevieve Lansing's world splintered into silence. Outside, Fifth Avenue shimmered under a pale sun, its carriages polished to brilliance, its women draped in silks, the color of whispered envy. Inside the Lansing mansion, the chandeliers glittered with deceptive serenity, throwing light over marble floors and velvet curtains, as if the house itself conspired to mask the tremor about to unfold. Genevieve had not meant to return early from her errand. The snow had turned to sleet, and the handsome cab driver, eager to be rid of the storm, had taken a shortcut. She crossed the vestibule with her gloves still on, her breath visible in the cold air, and paused at the threshold of the drawing room. What she saw then would become the pause between the life she had lived and the one she had yet to face. Harrison Lansing stood by the fireplace, his golden hair disheveled, his waistcoat unbuttoned. Beside him, half hidden in the heavy draperies, a woman barely out of girlhood clutched a silk shawl to her chest. Her perfume, violet and sugar, filled the air. For one suspended heartbeat, no one spoke. Even the fire seemed to recoil. Genevieve's first thought was not anger. It was disbelief at the quiet vulgarity of the scene. The tipped decanter, the lace glove fallen to the floor, the triviality of betrayal committed among gilt frames and fine carpets. When she finally moved, it was not toward hysteria, but clarity. "Leave," she said, her voice almost tender. Harrison turned, startled by her calm. "Genevieve, I said leave." She did not raise her voice. She did not throw a vase or a curse. She simply stood in her traveling cloak, her posture unyielding, while the other woman gathered her belongings with trembling hands. Harrison's attempt at charm faltered under the weight of her composure. When the door closed behind them, Genevieve was left with the scent of violets and the echo of her own breathing. She crossed to the mirror above the mantel, a French piece they had chosen together on their honeymoon in Paris. The reflection staring back at her was not that of a ruined woman, but of one awakening from illusion. Her eyes, once known for their soft warmth, now gleamed with something colder, steadier. "So this is what becomes of devotion," she whispered. The mirror caught her words and gave them back, brittle and exact. By nightfall, the servants knew. By morning, the city did. Gossip in New York traveled faster than light, through parlors, over luncheon tables, in the powder rooms of the Waldorf, and the whispers between pews at St. Thomas. Harrison Lansing's indiscretion became the talk of the week, but it was Genevieve who bore the punishment. The invitations ceased. The carriages that once halted before her door now passed without pause. A neighbor's maid, when delivering flowers, avoided her eyes as if shame were contagious. For several days, Genevieve lived in a haze of composure. She dismissed the household staff one by one, giving each a final payment in cash, her voice unwavering though her hands trembled beneath her gloves. The butler begged to remain. "Madam, the house will be so empty." But she only smiled faintly. "Emptiness is sometimes a blessing, Mr. Darnell." At twilight on the fifth day, a messenger arrived with a yellow envelope bearing a Boston seal. The paper trembled in her grasp as she read, "Gravely ill, surgery imminent, beg you to come, restaurant may close, trust only you. Alexander Pierce." She pressed the telegram to her chest. The world outside her window was grey and cruel, but somewhere in Boston a friend still believed her capable of rescue. For the first time since that terrible morning, her composure cracked, not from despair, but from purpose. That evening, she ascended the grand staircase slowly, her hand trailing over the carved balustrade. The portraits of her husband's ancestors lined the walls, stern men and powdered women staring down with disapproval. In her bedchamber, she opened the wardrobe and touched the silks that had once been armor. None of them would serve her now. She packed instead the simplest of dresses, a traveling cloak, and the pearl brooch her mother had given her long ago. When she descended the stairs for the last time, she paused in the drawing room. The fire had burned low, the embers dull and red. The mirror above the mantel caught her reflection once more, fractured slightly at the corner from a crack she had never noticed before. A tremor of poetic irony passed through her. "A perfect metaphor," she murmured. Then, with a calm gesture, she lifted a paperweight from the desk, a crystal globe that refracted light into 1,000 colors, and let it fall. The mirror shattered in an instant, scattering her image across the floor like fragments of a life already broken. The next morning, Fifth Avenue awoke to its usual symphony of wheels and hooves. At Grand Central, amid the hiss of steam and the clatter of trunks, a woman dressed in dark grey boarded the early train to Boston. She carried no companion, no maid, no trace of her former grandeur. Only a single suitcase rested beside her feet and a telegram folded carefully in her gloved hand. As the train began to move, Genevieve looked out at the receding skyline, the towers, the steeples, the shimmering city that had once worshipped and then discarded her. The reflection in the window showed a woman not defeated, but remade by sorrow. Her eyes, steady and luminous, followed the horizon as snow began to fall over the Hudson. And with that quiet, resolute departure, Genevieve Lansing left behind her shattered mirror and the ruins of a name that no longer defined her. Ahead lay Boston, unknown, uncertain but free, Boston Beacon Hill. The city greeted her not with grandeur, but with restraint. Where New York dazzled with polished brass and ceaseless clatter, Boston whispered through narrow streets and brick facades the color of autumn earth. The handsome cab that carried Genevieve Lansing from the station moved slowly through Beacon Hill slopes, wheels grinding against cobblestone, slick with mist. The lamps along the street glowed weakly through the fog, casting halos of pale gold upon the sidewalks. The air itself seemed different, denser, quieter, filled with a gravity that belonged to old money and older morals. When the cab stopped before her aunt's row house, Genevieve hesitated before stepping down. The modest dwelling stood wedged between two larger homes, its windows draped in lace rather than velvet, its doorway narrow and unassuming. She felt an ache of humility press upon her chest. Here, there were no footmen to open the door, no marble steps to announce her arrival. Only a small brass knocker, dulled by years of weather and use. Louisa Haven opened the door herself. Her silver hair was pinned tightly beneath a dark cap, her grey eyes sharp and unsentimental. Yet when they met Genevieve's, the edges softened. "You've come," she said simply, her New England vowels crisp and measured. "Come in, child. You'll freeze." Inside, the house smelled faintly of beeswax, tea, and the past. The parlour was tidy, though every object bore the trace of another era: mahogany furniture polished to a deep shine, a faded rug woven with intricate patterns, and on the mantel a small portrait of Louisa's late husband, stern and silent beneath a layer of dust. There were no chandeliers here, only a modest oil lamp that bathed the room in amber light. "I'm grateful for your kindness, Aunt Louisa," Genevieve murmured, removing her gloves. Her voice, though steady, carried the fatigue of sleepless nights and unspoken grief. Her aunt regarded her with quiet scrutiny. "Boston is not New York," she said at last. "People here mind their business, but they do not forget. Your name will raise questions. You must tread carefully." "I have no interest in society's approval." Genevieve replied, perhaps too quickly. Louisa's mouth twitched. That may be true, but approval is the currency that allows a woman to survive here. You'll learn that soon enough. They took tea by the window as snow began to fall outside, flakes clinging to the glass like ghostly fingerprints. Louisa spoke little, preferring silence to platitudes. When the tea cooled and the daylight faded, she showed Genevieve to a small upstairs room. The bed was narrow, the walls painted in muted cream, and a single framed embroidery above the dresser read, "Fortitude is a quiet virtue." That night, Genevieve lay awake, listening to the muffled sounds of hooves in the distance. The city felt both foreign and familiar, its sobriety a balm after the opulent cruelty of Fifth Avenue. Yet beneath the calm, she sensed an invisible scrutiny, as if Boston itself were watching, weighing her worth. By morning, a new purpose had taken root within her. She dressed in a dark blue wool day gown, plain but well-fitted, and gathered her hair in a modest twist. Gone were the silks and feathers that had once drawn admiration. In their place, practicality. Before leaving, Louisa handed her a small packet of banknotes. "For the cab fares. And remember," she said without looking up, "you are not here to prove anything to me or to them. You are here to work." The restaurant stood on Boylston Street, its narrow front wedged between a tailor's shop and a bookseller. Its sign, Pierce & Co. Dining Rooms, had lost much of its gilding. Inside, the atmosphere was one of faded elegance. Lace curtains yellowed with age filtered the weak daylight, and the once glossy floors bore the scratches of hurried service. The air smelled of butter, onions, and fatigue. The maître d', a tall man with thinning hair, looked her over with restrained disapproval. "Madam Lansing," he said stiffly, "Mr. Pierce wrote that you would be arriving to assist. I hope you understand this is an establishment of fine reputation. Our clientele expects discretion." "I intend to give them precisely that," she replied, removing her gloves. In the kitchen, organized chaos reigned. A cook barked orders, pans clattered, and the sous chef, a stocky man named Delaney, shot her a look that hovered between curiosity and contempt. "We weren't told we'd be having a lady boss," he muttered. Genevieve drew herself to her full height. "You won't. You'll have a manager." The remark earned a few smothered chuckles, but Delaney's expression remained stony. He wiped his hands on his apron and added, "With respect, ma'am, this isn't a drawing room. The ovens bite and so do the men." Her answer came without hesitation. "Then I'll wear gloves." The room went still. Then someone laughed softly, and even Delaney's scowl faltered. "Suit yourself," he said, turning back to the stove. Genevieve spent the entire day observing, taking notes, and learning the rhythm of the place. The ledgers in Alexander's office told a grim story. Weeks of dwindling income, rising debts, and supplies purchased on credit. By evening, she sat at the small wooden desk, her fingers tracing the inked columns. She had known luxury and loss, but never the raw pulse of survival. For the first time, she understood what it meant to be useful, to mend something not out of vanity, but necessity. When she returned home, Louisa awaited her in the parlour, knitting in the dim lamplight. "How was it?" "Exhausting," Genevieve admitted, "but I believe I can make it work." Her aunt's needles paused. "Be careful. The world has little patience for women who believe too much in themselves." Genevieve smiled faintly. "Then I shall test its patience." The following week unfolded with the disciplined monotony of hard work. She rose before dawn, oversaw the morning deliveries, and adjusted the menu to favor simpler, fresher dishes that required fewer imported goods. The chef grumbled at first, muttering about French refinement, but soon found himself grudgingly impressed when patrons praised the results. Yet the struggle went beyond logistics. Some clients, older men in tailored coats, their wives gloved and distant, whispered when she passed their tables. One afternoon, as she checked the dining room arrangements, she caught fragments of conversation. "Such a scandal to employ her here," one woman said, adjusting her lorgnette. "She's trying to atone," another replied. "Boston always did like a redemption story, so long as it remains incomplete." Genevieve felt the sting, but did not react. Instead, she leaned toward a waiter and corrected the placement of a single knife. Precision, she had learned, was its own armor. On her third Friday, the restaurant hosted a luncheon for a committee of prominent matrons supporting the new public library fund. The pressure was immense. A single failure could finish what Alexander had built. When the soup arrived too cold, Delaney muttered under his breath. Genevieve took the tray from his hands and carried it out herself. "Gentlemen may falter," she told him quietly, "but women cannot afford to." She smiled at the guests as if nothing were amiss, offered a graceful apology, and instructed the kitchen to begin again. By the meal's end, laughter filled the room, and one of the ladies, a severe widow in dove-grey silk, asked for her card. That night, as Genevieve stood by the back door watching the snow fall into the alley, Delaney approached, cap in hand. "You've got a strange way of running a house," he said gruffly, "but it works." She met his gaze. "You only think it's strange because you've never seen a woman refuse to fail." He nodded once and walked away. When Genevieve returned home, the parlor was quiet except for the ticking clock. Louisa was asleep, her knitting folded neatly beside her chair. Genevieve poured herself a small cup of tea and sat by the window. Beacon Hill was cloaked in snow. Every brick and lamplight softened beneath its weight. For the first time in months, the silence around her did not feel like exile. It felt like promise. She thought of Alexander, frail in his hospital bed, trusting her with what little remained of his life's work. She thought of the men who doubted her and the women who whispered her name like a warning. And she thought of the small satisfaction that came when a task was done, when a room ran smoothly, when respect, slow and fragile, was beginning to take shape. Her reflection in the glass was faint, blurred by frost, but her eyes still carried the steady fire that had refused to die even in disgrace. She reached for the embroidered words above the mantel, "Fortitude is a quiet virtue," and smiled. For now, it was enough. Boston, early spring of 1895. The snow had melted into narrow streams that trickled down Beacon Hill's cobblestones, washing away the filth of winter, but leaving the city's air no softer. Boston was a place that disguised judgment beneath courtesy, that measured one's worth in whispers and handshakes. Genevieve Lansing had been in the city only a few months, yet she already understood that the same eyes that smiled at her in daylight could turn cold the moment she left the room. The restaurant had begun to find its rhythm, slowly, cautiously, like a wounded bird testing its wings. But success, she soon learned, carried a cost. The higher she tried to rise, the more hands seemed ready to pull her down. One grey morning, as she sorted through the week's correspondence in Alexander's office, the doorbell chimed. A messenger delivered a sealed letter bearing the stamp of Harrison's bank. Genevieve's fingers hesitated before breaking the wax. The letter was polite in tone, merciless in intent. It informed her that certain accounts in her name, formerly under the management of Mr. Harrison Lansing, were now frozen pending further legal clarification. At the bottom, the signature gleamed. H. Lansing. She read it twice, her pulse steady, but her breath shallow. She could almost hear his voice, soft and condescending. "You may have pride, Genevieve, but I have power." When she told her aunt that evening, Louisa listened in silence, her knitting needles motionless. "He means to starve you out," she said finally. "It's the oldest trick in the book. When a woman refuses to crawl back, men often discover a sudden interest in morality." Genevieve smiled without humor. "Let him. I've learned to live on little." But the attack was not merely financial. Within days, a lawyer arrived at the restaurant, impeccably dressed, his courtesy as sharp as a blade. He introduced himself as Mr. Barrows, representing a Boston firm with certain New York associations. His visit, he assured her, was purely advisory. "The circumstances surrounding your divorce," he said, adjusting his gold spectacles, "are unfortunate. The social implications alone would be enough to discourage most women from remaining independent. But a union, discreetly arranged, might restore stability to your standing. Genevieve raised an eyebrow. A union? Remarriage, madam. There are gentlemen who admire a woman of your grace, and marriage would shield you from certain vulnerabilities. She folded her hands, the gesture graceful, her tone glacial. How comforting to know that respectability can be rented at the price of a wedding band. The lawyer cleared his throat, flustered. Forgive me, pardon, Miss Lansing. I speak only from practicality. Then allow me to do the same, she replied. Tell your employers that I prefer hunger to humiliation, and that I am neither a commodity nor a cautionary tale. When he left, she remained standing by the window, watching the steady procession of carriages along Boylston Street. For a long while, she said nothing, but inside her, something fierce began to root itself, an iron steadiness that no courtroom or banker could erode. That same week, the rhythm of the restaurant faltered. Supplies from the fishmonger arrived late, the butcher's invoice was higher than promised, and 2 servers left for better wages at a rival establishment. The sous-chef Delaney tried to hold the kitchen together, but even he seemed worn down by the tension that crept through the air like smoke. One Thursday afternoon, as Genevieve reviewed the day's menu, she overheard 2 waiters whispering in the pantry. They say the lady manager's husband is suing her, one murmured. In Boston, no decent woman manages a kitchen. It's bad luck. The words stung less than the tone, half pity, half disdain. But she said nothing, only closed her ledger and continued her work. She had learned that silence could wound more deeply than argument. 2 days later came the luncheon that would decide everything. It was a private affair for Mrs. Elizabeth Caldwell, a prominent benefactress of the new library fund and one of the most influential women in Boston society. If the event succeeded, doors might open. If it failed, the restaurant's reputation might not recover. From the moment Genevieve entered the kitchen that morning, she sensed unease. The air smelled of roasting herbs and anxiety. Delaney avoided her gaze, barking orders louder than necessary. "The sauce isn't ready," he snapped. "Who salted this too early?" By noon, the dining room gleamed. The linen was spotless, the silver polished to brilliance. Genevieve herself inspected each setting, adjusting a napkin here, a wineglass there, her movements precise as choreography. But behind the double doors of the kitchen, calamity brewed. The soup, delicate consommé meant to open the meal, had been ruined. Someone, either through carelessness or malice, had poured vinegar instead of wine into the broth. The sharp tang was unmistakable. Delaney cursed under his breath, throwing down his ladle. "It's finished! We'll have to serve it as is!" Genevieve stepped forward. "No," she said softly. "We will not." Her calm unsettled him more than anger would have. "Madam, we've got 10 minutes. The guests are seated. Then we will use 9. Without removing her gloves, she took command. She ordered onions to be browned again, instructed a young apprentice to strain what remained of the stock, and sent another running for Madeira. Her voice never rose above a conversational tone. When Delaney hesitated, she met his eyes. "You told me ovens bite," she said quietly, "but so do women who refuse to fail." By the time the first course reached the dining room, the chaos had transformed into harmony. Mrs. Caldwell's table glowed beneath the gaslights. The guests murmured their approval, unaware of the near disaster that had unfolded behind the swinging doors. Afterward, as Genevieve moved discreetly among the tables, Mrs. Caldwell beckoned her. The matron's eyes were shrewd, but not unkind. "Mr. Pierce was fortunate to have such a capable assistant," she said. "Boston needs women who do not tremble in the face of misfortune." "Boston," Genevieve replied with a faint smile, "teaches one how not to tremble." When the luncheon ended, applause rose not for the menu, but for the composure of its mistress. In a city ruled by restraint, Genevieve Lansing had mastered its most powerful language, grace under scrutiny. That evening, exhaustion settled over her like a heavy shawl. She returned to Beacon Hill long after dusk, her hands smelling faintly of thyme and ink. Louisa awaited her with the lamp still lit. "You look as though you've been to battle," her aunt remarked. "In a way I have," Genevieve replied, sinking into a chair. "But it was worth it." Louisa studied her face, noting the faint flush in her cheeks, the flicker of triumph in her eyes. "You've changed," she said finally. "I suppose disgrace is an efficient teacher." Her aunt's voice softened. "And what did it teach you today?" "That competence can silence gossip, if only for a moment." For a long time they sat together, the ticking of the clock filling the quiet. When Louisa rose to retire, Genevieve remained by the fire, its reflection glimmering in her eyes. She thought of Alexander lying in his sickbed, trusting her with his livelihood. She thought of Harrison, counting on her humiliation to finish what betrayal had begun. And she thought of the unexpected calm that now lived inside her, a strength that did not need applause to feel real. Near midnight, the post arrived. Among the bills and circulars lay a single envelope with Alexander's familiar hand. She broke the seal and unfolded the page, her tired eyes softening as she read. "My dear Genevieve, the doctor says I shall walk again by summer, though I suspect my restaurant already has stronger legs than I. Word of Mrs. Caldwell's luncheon reached me this morning. You've done what I could not, restored not only order but hope. I entrusted you with a failing house. You've given it a soul. You've already saved what I nearly lost." She pressed the letter to her chest, the faint scent of ink rising like memory. Outside, rain began to fall softly against the window, steady and cleansing. Genevieve looked into the fire once more. Its glow painted her face with light and shadow, a portrait of quiet defiance. The world might still see a fallen woman, but in that moment she saw only a builder, a woman reclaiming her name one day, one plate, one unbroken breath at a time. She rose, folded the letter carefully, and placed it beside her ledger. Tomorrow would bring new debts, new doubts, perhaps new betrayals. But tonight, as the rain whispered over Boston's rooftops, Genevieve allowed herself the smallest, most forbidden luxury of all: hope. Boston, late spring of 1895. The city had shed its winter grey and dressed itself in temperate elegance. Horse-drawn carriages glided down Boylston Street, the women beneath parasols and feathered bonnets, the men in straw boaters and silk cravats. In the public gardens, swan boats glided beneath budding trees, and lilacs perfumed the breeze. The world seemed to breathe with renewed grace. But inside the kitchen of Pierce & Co., there was no time for poetry. There was only the thrum of knives against boards, the hiss of butter meeting hot iron, and the quiet force of Genevieve Lansing's presence commanding a staff that, slowly, begrudgingly, had begun to respect her. The charity supper was not her idea, but she had embraced it with precision. The Ladies' Relief Society had chosen the restaurant as their venue for a fundraiser benefiting a children's hospital, and the matriarchs of Boston's Brahmin class would soon descend upon her dining room. Genevieve understood that a single misplaced fork or lukewarm dish could undo months of labor. Reputation in Boston, like crystal, was difficult to mend once cracked. She wore a gown of slate blue, simple in cut, with a high collar and white cuffs that spoke of both modesty and restraint. Her hair was swept into a chignon secured with 2 mother-of-pearl combs, and the only ornament she permitted herself was a small cameo at her throat, her mother's, worn like a whisper of memory. As the guests arrived, she greeted each with measured warmth. She knew their names, their family legacies, the careful hierarchies they constructed in drawing rooms and garden parties. Some regarded her with polite indifference, others with thinly veiled scrutiny. But none dared openly slight the woman who had, against all expectation, transformed a faltering establishment into a venue fit for their attention. It was just past 7 o'clock when he arrived. The doorman had not announced him, but Genevieve saw the shift in posture at the entrance, the way heads turned slightly, not in scandal, but in recognition. The man who entered wore no ostentation, yet carried with him the unmistakable air of someone used to being obeyed. His suit was midnight wool, tailored to broad shoulders, his coat brushed clean of dust. He removed his hat slowly, revealing hair thick and ash-brown, with a graceful touch of grey at the temples. And when he looked at her, she felt it, not the gaze of a man who sought to possess, but one who observed with deliberate intensity. Their eyes met across the dining room like the first chord of a nocturne, low and resonant. "Theodore Rathbone," he said when she approached. His voice was deep, cultured, but faintly worn, like fine leather softened by time. "I know the name," Genevieve replied. "Copper, shipping, grain. New York, I believe." His mouth curved with amusement. "And here I thought I might go unrecognized in Boston. In this room, certainly not." He glanced around. "It's yours, isn't it? The rhythm of it, the control. A house only runs this well when someone's heart beats behind every wall." She was not a woman easily unsettled, but his words struck a chord she hadn't realized lay exposed. "It belongs to Mr. Pierce," she answered carefully. "I simply manage what he entrusted to me." Then he chose wisely. A waiter passed with a silver tray, and Genevieve excused herself, retreating to the safety of motion. Yet something in her chest remained stirred, like the surface of water after a stone has been dropped. Later, as the evening wore on, she noticed him again, seated near the fireplace, his meal untouched for long stretches as he observed the room, not as a critic, but as one who catalogued details for later reflection. He made no demands, requested no special treatment, yet each time their gazes crossed, Genevieve felt the air shift. When dessert was served, a pear tart glazed with lemon and thyme, he finally beckoned her with the gentlest motion of his hand. "Tell me," he said, "do you always walk your floor like a general surveying his troops?" "I prefer conductor," she replied, her tone light. "Less blood, more harmony." He leaned back slightly, appraising her with eyes of cold steel warmed by interest. "You do it well, and I imagine you've had to." She did not answer that. Instead, she tilted her head. "You're far from your empire tonight, Mr. Rathbone. Sometimes it's necessary to leave the empire to remember how quiet the world can be." A silence stretched between them, not awkward, but charged with the kind of tension that lives in pauses too long to be accidental. "I must return to the kitchen," she said, though she had no immediate need. "Of course," he said, rising. "But before I go, allow me this." He drew from his pocket a small ivory card and placed it gently on the white linen tablecloth. "For the best run house I've seen all season. That includes Delmonico's." She took the card, fingers brushing his as she did. It was a fleeting touch, gloved against the world, but the warmth that passed between them required no bare skin. "Thank you," she murmured. He nodded once, replaced his hat, and left with the same quiet gravity with which he had entered. No one else in the room seemed to grasp the moment, yet to Genevieve it lingered like perfume after the wearer has gone. She returned to the kitchen to find Delaney waiting near the ledger. He said nothing at first, only looked at her with a new and cautious respect. "Everything go well?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Better than expected." The following evening, he returned. This time, he did not ask for an introduction. He requested the window table, the one near the entrance, where light from the street lamp fell in dappled gold across the linen. He came alone and brought a book, but rarely read it. Instead, he watched the rhythm of the restaurant, as if listening to a song he could not name. Genevieve noticed the way the waiters straightened their vests when passing his table. The kitchen, too, ran smoother that night. Even Delaney began calling out orders with more intention, no longer arguing with her adjustments. As she passed near his table, Theodore spoke again. "Do you ever sit?" he asked, not unkindly. "Or does command require motion? If I sit, they might think I've grown tired, and tired women lose authority." He smiled at that. "And you have no intention of losing yours?" "None." Again their eyes met. There were no declarations, no flirtations, no promises. Only that same charged stillness, like two dancers poised before a first step, the music not yet begun. When he left, she found another note tucked beneath his plate. It said nothing more than, "Return is not always weakness. Sometimes it's grace." She tucked it into the pocket of her ledger. That evening, as she stood by the back door watching the moon cast silver across the alley, she allowed herself to close her eyes. Her life had been reduced, rebuilt, redefined. Yet tonight it had expanded again, if only by one table, one gaze, one carefully chosen word. And though she told no one, she would remember the feeling of his eyes across the room. Not because they promised rescue, but because for the first time in a long time, they saw her not as a ruin, but as a force. Boston, early June of 1895. The lilacs had begun to fade, replaced by the scent of sun-warmed brick and freshly laundered curtains hung from open windows. The days stretched longer now, and the evenings softened like silk between one breath and the next. It was the kind of season that made one believe in beginnings again, even when surrounded by endings. The first letter arrived folded inside a crisp ivory envelope, bearing a New York return address written in an elegant, slanted hand. It had no accompanying flowers, no calling card, no assumption of familiarity, only the name Theodore Rathbone above a precise row of lines. Genevieve stood by the pantry window when the maître d' handed it to her. She recognized the script at once. Her fingers, strong from work and ink-stained from ledgers, trembled only slightly as she broke the seal. "Miss Lansing, I hope this note finds you amid calm days and an efficient staff, though I suspect the latter is more rare than the former. Allow me, perhaps selfishly, the indulgence of continued conversation. There is something in the quiet elegance of your presence that lingers. Boston suits you, though I wonder if you allow yourself to belong to it yet. I do not write out of presumption, but interest, genuine and unhurried. If you have the time and the inclination, I would be honored by your reply. With measured respect, Theodore Rathbone." Genevieve read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and slipped it into the drawer of the desk in Alexander's office. That evening, after the staff had gone, and only the clink of glasses being polished remained, she sat with pen in hand and hesitated for a long while before writing. When she did, her words came not with flourish, but with clarity. "Mr. Rathbone, I confess I am wary of correspondence with men I do not know well. The world offers little forgiveness to women who speak openly, but I found your letter, curiously, comforting. I, too, believe in the power of quiet conversation. Boston is reserved. The city and I are still learning to live with each other. I manage. Some days I succeed, others I endure, but I am learning the difference. I will write, for now, but not to entertain, only to reflect. Sincerely, Genevieve Lansing." And so the letters began, once a week, then twice, folded and sealed with discipline, never scented, never adorned. But within there bloomed a richness of thought, a cadence of intellect and restraint that soon made her long for the rustle of paper beneath her fingers. Theodore's words were careful, yet never cautious. He wrote of business, yes, of market fluctuations and the precarious future of rail lines, but also of books he was rereading with his son, of the absurdity of men in power who mistook ruthlessness for wisdom, of the empty vastness of his home on Gramercy Park that had grown even quieter since his wife's death. "Henry asked me today why I wear the same watch every day," he wrote. "I told him it was your eyes. They reminded me of the same metal, sturdy and bright and hard to tarnish." Genevieve's answers were measured but not cold. She allowed him glimpses into the balancing act of her days, the fragile harmony of managing men who resented her authority and patrons who questioned her decency. She described the ache in her hands after long hours, the comfort of routine, the silence of Boston nights compared to the roar of Manhattan. "I'm learning that dignity is not always graceful," she wrote. "Sometimes it is clenched fists and unshed tears. Sometimes it is swallowing the urge to explain yourself to those who have already judged you." Their exchange became, over time, not indulgent, but necessary. A sanctuary built of ink and distance, untouched by gossip or intrusion. But peace, like reputation, was a fragile thing. One Friday morning, Louisa entered the restaurant carrying the Boston Evening Transcript, her gloves folded tightly in one hand. She did not speak at first, but laid the paper flat across the ledger and pointed. The column was thin, but potent. Rumors from New York suggest that a once respectable divorcee, now residing among the lace curtains of Beacon Hill, has not only opened her doors to a widowed magnate, but may have opened more than that. It seems Mr. R. has taken an interest in Boston's culinary scene, and in the woman commanding it. Genevieve read the words in silence, then folded the paper once, twice, until the ink disappeared inside creases. "It's begun," she said simply. "The world might forgive a man for betrayal," Louisa answered, "but it rarely forgives a woman for surviving it." The weeks that followed proved her right. 2 regular patrons cancelled reservations with vague excuses. A society matron arrived, only to leave after glancing at Genevieve's face. Suppliers hesitated on invoices. Even the maitre d', normally so polished, began avoiding her eyes. Her staff, to their credit, remained steadfast, though tension rippled through the kitchen like steam from a boiling pot. Late one evening, Genevieve stood alone in the dining room, the chairs stacked, the lights dimmed. She placed her palms flat on a linen-draped table and bowed her head, not in surrender but in weariness. Louisa found her there. "I thought you might still be here," her aunt said softly, setting down her cane before sitting beside her. Genevieve looked up. Her eyes were dry, but her voice trembled at the edges. "Why does surviving make them hate me more than failing ever did?" Louisa's hands, wrinkled and sure, reached across the table and took hers. There was a long silence before she spoke. "When I was 22, she said slowly, "I loved a man who was never mine to keep. He was married and kind and unhappy. He told me he would leave her, but he never did. When his wife found out, he blamed me, said I had tempted him, ruined his peace. His reputation recovered. Mine did not. I was sent to Charleston to live with a cousin. It was exile disguised as compassion." Genevieve listened without interruption, her grip tightening slightly around Louisa's fingers. "I stayed quiet for decades, never told a soul, because I thought I deserved the silence." Louisa exhaled shakily. "But you, Genevieve, you do not. You have built something from the ashes. They may try to shame you, but you are the one with the hammer now. Let them whisper. You are not made of paper." It was the closest to an embrace her aunt had ever given her. That night, Genevieve returned home and opened the drawer where she kept Theodore's letters. She selected the most recent and read it again, slowly. "If I could take every cruel word spoken against you and bury it beneath my city, I would. But I know your pride is stronger than my protection. You will walk through this. You already are." She took up her pen. "Mr. Rathbone, they have begun their games. I remain unbroken, but weary. Your letters remain the only voices that ask nothing of me but truth. For that I am grateful. I do not seek rescue, I seek respect. You seem to offer both." She sealed the letter with steady hands. Outside, the city turned its gaslights on, one by one, and somewhere between the quiet streets of Boston and the towers of New York, 2 souls continued to bridge the distance, across rails, across judgment, across the echoing silence left behind by all they had endured. Boston, late June of 1895. The evening began with wind, not the gentle kind that rustles leaves and cools sun-warmed skin, but a damp, pressing wind that surged from the harbour and rattled shutters across Beacon Hill. It carried the scent of rain and unrest, a harbinger of disruption that Genevieve Lansing recognized long before the first guest stepped through the restaurant's doors. She awoke that morning with the unsettling clarity that often precedes disaster. The sky had turned a sickly silver, heavy with unshed water, and the city itself seemed restless. Carriages rolled with less grace, conversations in the market broke more quickly, and even the gas lamps flickered as if bracing for the inevitable. Tonight was meant to be a triumph. A dinner for the board of the Boston Children's Hospital, accompanied by donors from Harvard Medical School and prominent city benefactors. It had taken months to secure the engagement, months of letters, quiet persuasion, and careful management of reputation. The menu had been planned to the hour, the wine ordered with the help of a sommelier, and the pastry course entrusted to the new chef pâtissier whose resume had arrived from Paris by way of Providence. But by 9 o'clock that morning, the storm had already begun. First came the telegram from the fishmonger, a shipment delay due to dockyard unrest. No oysters, no sole, no bluefin. The menu's centerpiece had vanished. Genevieve read the message once and closed her eyes, exhaling slowly. She paced the back kitchen, skirts brushing the tiled floor as she revised the evening's vision entirely. "Send someone to the North End," she told Delaney, who had grown into a quiet lieutenant these last weeks. "Buy anything fresh. Scallops, mussels, clams. We'll improvise." Delaney nodded, already scribbling. And the pastry? That was the second blow. Not an hour later, the pastry chef threw down his apron and quit mid-preparation, muttering in accented English about the impossible standards of Boston society and mad women who think they're generals. He stormed out through the back alley, leaving unfinished dough and an enraged sous chef in his wake. Genevieve said nothing. She merely removed her gloves, rolled up the sleeves of her high-collared blouse, and moved to the prep table. "Apple tartlets," she said, "with thyme and honey. We'll use the Vermont apples and that French butter from last week. I'll do it myself." Delaney blinked. "You haven't baked in months." She met his eyes with quiet steel. "Then let's hope it's like riding a horse." Outside, the wind howled. By 5 o'clock, the rain arrived. It slashed sideways through the streets, soaking the awnings and scattering passers-by. And with the rain came voices, sharp, moralistic, rising from the mouths of the temperance women who had chosen that very evening to protest. They stood outside the restaurant in a line of grey cloaks and black umbrellas, brandishing signs that read, "Liquor breeds ruin, and virtue begins at home." They chanted in rhythm, their tones righteous and practiced. Genevieve stared at them from the dining room window, jaw set. "They're not here for the wine," Louisa said from her seat in the corner, knitting as if unbothered. "They're here for you." "I know. They smell blood in the water, darling. That's the only time they ever bother with torches." Genevieve said nothing. The table linens had been pressed, the silver polished, the wine decanted, but the air inside the restaurant crackled with tension, the kind that even the scent of rosemary bread and roasted lemon could not mask. At 7 o'clock, the doors were due to open. At 6:42 he arrived. No announcement, no fanfare, just a sudden presence by the door as rain streamed down his overcoat and darkened the shoulders of his wool suit. Theodore Rathbone, solemn as thunder, stepped inside with an umbrella in one hand and a small bouquet of violets in the other. Genevieve turned, and their eyes met. "You're not on the guest list," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not a guest," he replied, removing his coat. "I'm here to work." Before she could protest, he had rolled up his sleeves, revealing forearms shaped by labor and discipline rather than idle comfort. He stepped behind the bar without hesitation, took up a cloth, and began polishing the stemware with the precision of a man cleaning instruments for surgery. Genevieve stood frozen for a moment, then found her footing. "You've never waited a table in your life." "No," he said, "but I've run warehouses, managed 500-man crews, and packed my own trunks when every valet in New York decided I wasn't worth their effort. I think I can handle a wine glass." For a beat she stared at him, drenched, determined, and entirely without vanity. "Very well," she said. "You're hired." The staff, watching from the kitchen, passed through, exchanged glances, but said nothing. The guests began to arrive. Despite the rain, despite the protests, the tables filled with men and women cloaked in influence. Laughter emerged slowly, tempered by the storm outside, but coaxed forward by the warmth within. The scallop stew, rich with cream and saffron, was met with murmurs of pleasure. The tartlets, imperfect in form but golden and fragrant, disappeared in minutes. The wine flowed gently, not excessively, and the temperance voices outside became a distant drone. Through it all, Theodore moved without presumption. He carried wine, adjusted chairs, whispered small reassurances to startled servers, and once, only once, when Genevieve passed him too closely while inspecting a table, their fingers brushed. The contact was fleeting, accidental, but it left her breathless in a way she dared not name. By the time dessert had been served, the protesters had dispersed. The rain eased, and the restaurant, against all odds, glowed with soft triumph. When the last guest left, Genevieve stood at the center of the dining room, surrounded by empty plates and candle stubs. She exhaled slowly, her spine relaxing for the first time all day. "You should go," she told him gently. "I will," he said, removing his apron. But he didn't. Not yet. He moved to the phonograph in the corner, wound it slowly, and set the needle down. A waltz, quiet and fragile, began to play. Its notes hesitant at first, then sure. He extended his hand. Genevieve looked at it, then at him. "There's no one left to impress," he said, "and I'm told you know how to command a room." She placed her hand in his. They danced not as lovers, but as two people who had survived storms too long to pretend at artifice. Her head never touched his shoulder, his hand never strayed beyond her waist. Yet the silence between them was a language more honest than words. The music played on. When it ended, he stepped back, bowed and whispered, "You do more than manage, Miss Lansing. You endure with grace. It is a rare thing." She swallowed once, then twice, unable to speak. He left quietly, the door closing behind him with the same subtlety with which he had entered. An hour later, as the last candles were snuffed and the kitchen wiped down, Alexander Pierce arrived. He moved slowly, supported by a cane, but his eyes held their old fire. Genevieve met him in the hallway, surprised. "You shouldn't be out in this weather," she said, her hands reaching instinctively to steady him. "I heard it was your night," he answered, his voice rough with fatigue. "I wanted to see for myself." He looked around. The walls, the gleaming cutlery, the lingering scent of time and something sweeter. "You've done more than preserve it," he said. "You've transformed it." She smiled, humbled and steady. "I've done what I could." Alexander studied her a long moment, then took a folded paper from his coat and placed it in her hand. A contract, partial ownership, her name beside his. "If you stay," he said, "this can be yours, truly." She stared at the paper, then looked at him. "I don't need your answer now." She nodded. "Good, because I don't have it yet." That night, alone in the dining room with her thoughts and the quiet rhythm of rain resuming against the windows, Genevieve lit one final candle and sat with her hand over the contract. Outside, the storm had passed, but in her heart a different kind of wind stirred, one that whispered not of loss or survival, but of something altogether rarer: choice. New York, early July of 1895. The city shimmered under the weight of heat and expectation. The carriages rolled slower down Fifth Avenue, their horses panting against the stone. Gentlemen loosened their cravats when decorum allowed, and ladies waved fans not just to flirt, but to breathe. But beneath the oppressive summer haze, the city pulsed with the same old hunger, for scandal, for spectacle, for someone to rise or fall in plain view. Genevieve Lansing returned to this glittering crucible not as the society wife she once was, but as something far rarer, a woman determined to write her own ending. The journey from Boston had been quiet, the compartment filled with the low hum of steel wheels and the occasional rustle of legal briefs. Theodore sat beside her, reading through the case files with the same calm he reserved for mergers and market crashes. She meanwhile watched the passing landscape and measured her breath, each inhale a step closer to reckoning. Her gloves were pale grey, trimmed with a single pearl button. Her gown, a deep navy with ivory pinstripes, fit precisely at the waist and rose to a lace collar at her throat. Her hair, pinned in a smooth twist, did not tremble when she did. When the train reached Grand Central, the heat struck her like a memory. Everything here was louder, quicker, brighter than Boston. But it was not the same city she had fled. Or perhaps she was not the same woman who had fled it. The following morning, the courthouse rose before her like a cathedral built of cold stone and colder stairs. Word had spread quickly, as such things did. The scandalized socialite, the betrayal, the tycoon at her side. There were no empty benches in the gallery. Every seat was filled with eyes sharpened by gossip and lips poised to repeat what they witnessed. Harrison Lansing stood by his counsel, his blonde hair gleaming under the gaslight, his navy coat tailored with surgical precision. He wore the same smile he had used to charm her at 23, wide, practiced, hollow. It had not aged a day. He did not look at her when she entered. Genevieve walked to her seat without faltering, her heels clicking steadily against the marble floor. Theodore sat behind her, his presence as silent as a fortress, his eyes never straying. The proceedings began with the usual parade of papers and procedural tones. Harrison's attorney, grey-haired and smug, rose with affected gravity and addressed the court as if defending a wounded patriarch. "My client," he intoned, "has endured months of abandonment. His household collapsed under the absence of his wife, whose pursuits in Boston have become the subject of unfortunate public discourse. He seeks restoration of property and the correction of reputation." Genevieve did not react. Her fingers remained interlaced in her lap, her back straight. The courtroom was too warm, and the judge, a man with a stern brow and an impatient air, wiped his temple with a handkerchief. Harrison took the stand. He spoke of a marriage troubled by distance, of a wife discontented with comfort, of emotional cruelty cloaked in silence and ambition. His voice was smooth, his posture contrite. He cast glances toward the gallery as if performing a soliloquy. "She chose to leave," he said, "to humiliate me, to seek attention elsewhere. I was loyal. I was patient." When it was Genevieve's turn, she rose slowly. The silence was immediate and absolute. She did not look at the judge, nor the gallery. She looked only at Harrison. "I did leave," she said, "but I did not abandon." Her voice carried, soft but unwavering. "I left a house where silence had become cruelty. I left a man who filled our rooms with perfume that was not mine, with letters he burned before I could read them. I left because if I stayed, I would have become the ghost you wished I already was." A murmur stirred in the gallery. The judge raised a hand. Genevieve reached into her reticule and produced a folded note. "This," she said, holding it aloft, "was given to me by the woman with whom my husband shared my home. He discarded her when it suited him, just as he tried to discard me. She sent me this after I left. She had no reason to lie. She had already lost everything." The judge accepted the paper. "Read it once, then again." Silence fell like ash. When the ruling came, it was swift. Property returned, accounts unfrozen, her name legally and irrevocably restored. Outside, the steps of the courthouse were ablaze with sunlight and flashes from the new invention of the age, the press camera. Reporters shouted questions, their voices tumbling over each other in a frenzy of scandal and ink. But the crowd fell still when Genevieve stepped into the light. She did not smile. She did not wave. She only descended the marble stairs with measured grace, Theodore walking 2 paces behind her. A journalist, young, freckled, barely older than Henry, lowered his notebook and murmured to no one in particular, "The fallen lady rose higher than anyone expected." That evening, the city's noise fell away as they walked along Gramercy Park. Theodore's townhouse stood modest and dignified behind iron gates, ivy crawling up the brick. Inside, the parlour was simple. Dark wood, tall windows, a leather armchair softened by years. No chandeliers, no silk. Henry waited in the hallway, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. He was a boy, caught in the fragile moment between childhood and something heavier, taller. His jacket was too small, his collar too high, but his eyes, grey like his father's, were kind. "Miss Lansing," he said awkwardly, and offered her something wrapped in parchment. She opened it gently. A single pressed flower, pale blue, from the garden, perhaps. "It's not perfect," he said, "but I thought maybe you'd like it." Genevieve swallowed. "Thank you," she said, her voice catching like thread in a needle. "I do." Theodore watched from the corner, silent. Later, in the guest room with its quiet bed and open window, Genevieve placed the flower on the nightstand beside her gloves. She touched its petals gently, then turned off the lamp. Outside, the city whispered through the trees, its usual thunder softened by summer wind. Inside, a woman once broken sat in silence, whole, scarred, and rising. And in the stillness of that New York night, the drawing room that once held ashes now held breath. New York, mid-July of 1895, the sun pressed down upon Gramercy Park with the full, unwavering weight of summer. The city, though dressed in its usual layers of ambition and elegance, moved with a languid rhythm beneath the heat. Horse-drawn carriages veered toward the shade, newspaper boys shouted headlines from beneath damp caps, and the scent of hydrangeas wafted from iron-wrought gardens where only the privileged held keys. In a quiet building just beyond the park, Genevieve Lansing signed her name, her full name, her only name, at the bottom of a lease that would not only give her shelter, but shape. The ink bled slightly on the page, the nib having been pressed a touch too hard, but she did not pause to blot. She wanted the stroke to remain, bold, permanent. The townhouse she had chosen was modest by New York standards. Narrow, with shuttered windows and ivy climbing the brick, it had no parlour grand enough for balls, no servant's bell in every corner, no ballroom desperate for chandeliers. But it had warmth and light, and enough space for a writing desk by the window, and she would not live in shadows again. Theodore had offered her the former Lansing mansion on East 65th, an estate now empty, its marble halls echoing with a silence purchased by pride. But Genevieve declined without hesitation. "I left that house a prisoner," she had said. "I do not intend to return as a queen." Her decision to open a restaurant in New York had not been planned. It had begun, like most meaningful things in her life, with a letter. Alexander, still recovering in Boston but restless, had written with an idea and a list of names. "There is a former printing shop near the East River," he wrote. "The bones are good, the ceiling's high. The rest is yours to imagine." She did imagine it. Each window pane, each copper pan, each plate of lemon-roasted chicken and honeyed fig, and slowly, with Theodore's discreet investment and her own resolve, that dream took form. The restaurant was christened The Second Table. The name had come to her one night as she traced the lines of her past across a linen napkin. The second table, in fine homes, had always been where servants dined, where children were kept before they were deemed presentable, where women were sent when they dared speak too boldly. She had eaten at that table in silence. Now she would own it, and it would be a table of firsts. The building had once been the office of a literary press, and remnants of its past still lingered. The smell of ink, the grooved wooden floors, the heavy beams overhead that bore the weight of forgotten poetry. She kept those bones intact and added her own signature: mahogany chairs, glass lamps blown in cobalt, and mirrors, not to reflect vanity, but to reflect movement, the dance of creation. The menu was both precise and surprising. Boston's severity met New York's daring. Baked oysters with absinthe cream, honey-glazed duck with a dash of thyme, lemon tart with cracked black pepper and rose petals. Each dish was a reflection of where she had been and who she had become. Opening night arrived with little fanfare. Genevieve had refused advertisements. She wanted the food, the light, the space to speak before the critics did. The staff wore cream waistcoats and soft shoes to silence their steps. Candles flickered in mirrored sconces, and she stood at the entrance, her hands steady, her eyes clear. She wore no jewels that evening, only a slate-colored silk gown with buttons down the front and a wide satin sash at the waist. Her hair, coiled at her nape, was secured with a single silver pin. At her throat, a brooch shaped like an olive branch rested, a gift from Louisa, sent by post with a note that read, "Build it, then let them knock on your door." They did. The first guest through the door was a woman Genevieve had not seen in over a year, Margaret Van Allen, tall, severe, and cloaked in sable despite the heat. Her presence was not a courtesy, it was a challenge. "I assume you have a table?" Margaret said without greeting, her voice crisp enough to cut through linen. Genevieve did not blink. "For you, of course." She signaled to the maitre d', who guided Margaret to a table in the center of the room. Genevieve could feel every gaze in the restaurant shift, and yet her hands remained still. From the kitchen came the clatter of saucepans, the scent of seared herbs and melting butter. Everything moved with precision, no mistakes, no falter. The rhythm she had cultivated in Boston, once doubted, now breathed through the walls of the second table. Midway through the evening, Margaret sent back the wine. Then the salad. The staff handled her with poise, but the tension in the room thickened. Genevieve made her way to the table. "Is everything to your taste, Mrs. Van Allen?" Margaret looked up, her eyes narrowing. "I suppose it's fashionable now to dine beneath exposed beams and watch the cook," she said, "though it's less of a restaurant and more of a statement." Genevieve's smile did not waver. "I've learned that statements often leave a better taste than silence." Margaret raised her glass and took a sip. Then, without another word, she stayed. She stayed through the main course, the salad, the dessert, and when the final plate was cleared, she nodded once in Genevieve's direction and left, not with disdain, but with a look Genevieve could only interpret as acknowledgement. Later that night, as the staff polished the last glass and the city exhaled around them, Theodore entered through the side door. He wore no tie, his sleeves rolled up, the faint scent of tobacco trailing him. "You were magnificent," he said simply, leaning against the bar. "I was deliberate," she replied. He approached her but did not touch her. He merely watched. "They'll write about it," he said. "You'll be in the papers. Let them. Rumor says the Herald will name you one of the top 10 women to watch next year." She looked up at him, her voice low and dry. "Let them watch." They stood in silence for a while, the candlelight catching in the silver threads at his temple, the soft glow tracing the arch of her cheek. There was no need for declarations. Everything between them had already been said, in letters, in gestures, in the shared labor of building something from dust. That night, in the stillness of the empty dining room, Genevieve walked to the front window. She touched the glass pane, where the words, "the second table," had been etched by hand, each letter a reminder of all she had been told she could not do. She traced the G of her first name, her true name, with the tip of her finger. Behind her, laughter echoed faintly from the kitchen, followed by the chime of a glass being lifted. She closed her eyes and allowed herself a single, silent breath of contentment. Outside, the gas lamps flickered along the edge of Gramercy Park, their flames steady against the hush of night. Inside, a name carved in glass glowed softly in the dark. A name not of a wife, not of a widow, but of a woman risen, remembered, and never again silenced. New York, December of 1895. The city had fallen silent beneath a blanket of snow. Carriages moved like ghosts down the narrow streets, their wheels muffled by the thick white hush that winter had laid over Manhattan. Shopkeepers shuttered their windows early, lamplighters struggled against the icy wind, and from the rooftops of Gramercy Park, chimneys exhaled plumes of silver smoke that curled into the dusky sky. Inside the second table, the candles flickered in their sconces, casting golden halos across polished glasses and velvet-draped chairs. Genevieve stood alone in the front parlor after the last guest had departed, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea she did not drink. Her breath misted faintly in the air. The coal stove worked faithfully, but the wind found every crevice. Louisa had gone to bed early, wrapped in a shawl and humming a half-remembered lullaby from Charleston. The restaurant was closed for the night, the staff dismissed early due to the worsening snowstorm. Only the silence remained now, thick and expectant. A knock. She turned, surprised. Few dared venture out in such weather. She crossed the tiled floor and opened the door to find Theodore Rathbone standing there, his coat dusted with snow, his hair damp, and his eyes dark with something she could not yet name. "I was on my way home when I remembered," he said quietly, holding out his gloved hand. Resting in his palm was a single brass key. It gleamed despite the dim light, its teeth intricate, its bow worn smooth by time. "This belongs to my study. The top floor overlooks the park." Genevieve stared at it, unmoving. "I'm not offering you an obligation," he continued, his voice grave and measured, "nor a proposal. Not tonight. I'm offering space, a door that's yours, if ever you wish to open it. Nothing more." He didn't press the key into her hand. He left it on the entry table beside her and stepped back into the night. The door closed gently behind him. For a long while Genevieve did not move. The key sat between her gloves and a crystal dish of lavender lozenges. It looked almost out of place beside such domestic things, yet its presence filled the room. That night, she could not sleep. Wrapped in her winter cloak, she left Louisa a note, "Gone for a walk," and stepped into the snow. The gas lamps flickered along the empty sidewalks, casting long, trembling shadows across the cobblestones. She walked past the second table, its windows dark but familiar, past the ice-crusted iron gates of Gramercy Park, where she paused, breath rising in the cold, lashes damp with snowflakes. She stood beneath the same tree where she had once watched children skate in autumn. Tonight there were no children, only the storm and the echo of her own footsteps. She looked up at the windows of Theodore's townhouse across the square. One was lit, softly, steadily, perhaps his study. Perhaps the key truly did open a room above the park, a place untouched by gossip and grief, a space carved not by inheritance, but invitation. Still, she did not cross the street. She turned instead and went home. Louisa was asleep. The fire had burned low, and upon the hall table lay a letter. Her name was scrawled across the envelope in a hurried but familiar hand. Alexander. She broke the seal with chilled fingers and read by lamplight, her shadow cast long against the wall. "Dearest Genevieve, there are many kinds of courage. You have mastered the art of leaving, of breaking from what no longer serves you, but I hope with all tenderness that you'll remember there is also courage in staying, in choosing where to place your roots, in standing still not out of fear, but out of love. I nearly lost everything because I waited too long to name what mattered most. You, my friend, are not bound to repeat that lesson. Yours in admiration, Alexander." She folded the letter slowly. The lamp crackled. Snow hissed softly against the window panes. She did not sleep that night, but watched the sky lighten from slate to pewter, dawn casting a silvery sheen across the rooftops. By morning, the storm had calmed. The streets lay blanketed in white, and the city seemed to exhale. Genevieve dressed deliberately. A wool travelling skirt in ash grey, a matching coat cinched with a belt of silk ribbon. No jewels. Only her gloves, her hat with the feathered brim, and a small brass key. Not the one Theodore had left, but one of her own. It was engraved with delicate script, "Second table." She stepped into the street, her boots crunching over fresh snow, her pace steady. The Rathbone building rose like a quiet monument of brick and ivy, its upper windows touched by early sunlight. She entered through the side, nodding to the porter. The elevator was slow and creaked at every landing. Theodore's office overlooked Broadway. His secretary rose, startled to see her. "I believe Mr. Rathbone is in conference," the young man stammered. "Then I shall wait," she said simply, and took a seat near the coat stand. She did not fidget, did not pace. At last, the door opened. Theodore stepped into the foyer, speaking over his shoulder to some financier. His voice fell when he saw her. She stood and approached. He watched her closely, uncertain. She reached into her coat pocket and held out her key. "This," she said, "is to the back door of my restaurant. It's where the deliveries arrive and where the staff takes their break, and where I sometimes step out when the noise inside becomes too much. I'm not asking you to use it, but if ever you find yourself near Gramercy, it's yours." He looked down at the key in her hand, then back at her. "Not a ring," he murmured. "Not yet," she replied. "But I wanted you to know I'm not running anymore." He took the key slowly, as if accepting something fragile and sacred. His fingers brushed hers. The contact was brief, but the meaning was indelible. She turned to go, but paused. "I've made space too," she said over her shoulder. "I just didn't realize until now." As the door closed behind her, Theodore stood in silence, his palm closing gently around the key. The city outside stirred to life again. The snow began to melt under carriage wheels and early sun, but inside both of them, something new was just beginning to root, quietly, irrevocably, in the rooms with two keys. New York, January of 1896. A quiet snow fell over Gramercy Park that morning, soft as lace on the iron railings. The trees were bare, their branches etched like ink against the silver sky, and the city held its breath beneath the hush of winter. Inside the townhouse above the second table, the warmth of firelight touched the panelled walls, turning shadows into silk and silence into reverence. Genevieve stood before the parlour window, her reflection ghosted in the frosted glass. Her dress was not white. It was cream, the colour of almond milk, simple in silhouette, made of heavy satin with a row of covered buttons trailing down her back like pearls. No veil, no train. Only a single comb of mother-of-pearl holding her hair in a low knot, and a bouquet of ivory roses tied with a navy ribbon, now resting in Aunt Louisa's trembling hands. Henry shifted nervously at the side of the fireplace, straightening his collar for the third time. At 15, he was all long limbs and solemn eyes, but today he stood tall beside his father, his fingers tight around a silver ring box, as if holding a secret too heavy for words. Theodore turned when Genevieve entered the room. He did not smile at first. He simply looked at her, his eyes filled with a reverence so still and profound, it made her breath catch. No one spoke. The ceremony, such as it was, began without music. There was no officiant but a kindly judge who had dined at the second table many times and once called Genevieve the only woman who made oysters respectable again. The vows were short. She did not cry, neither did he. But when Theodore took her hand, when he placed the ring upon her finger and whispered, "Now we are entirely ours," the tremor in her chest was louder than any orchestra. Louisa, holding the bouquet, dabbed at her eyes discreetly. There was no announcement in the herald, no bells, no horse-drawn procession through the avenues, but before nightfall, word had spread. By evening, the restaurant below filled with life. Candlelight danced across polished mahogany and crisp linen. The chandeliers, once salvaged from a shuttered opera house, sparkled above a sea of guests who had travelled from 2 cities to stand in quiet rebellion against propriety. There were bankers in wool coats beside bakers in flour-dusted shoes. Matrons with diamond pins sipped wine beside widows in worn gloves. Writers with ink-stained cuffs toasted in French to the new owners. At the center of it all was a long table, not for the bride and groom, but for the staff. The chefs, servers, dishwashers, and porters. Genevieve had insisted. They carried this house, she said. Tonight they dine first. Theodore stood beside her for hours, not as her protector, but as her partner. He spoke little, allowing her voice to carry the room. When he did lean close, it was to murmur something only she could hear. Words that made her laugh low and rare, the kind of laugh one only learns after heartbreak. And yet, the moment that lingered came later. The hour had grown late. The guests were still sipping, the music winding down. Henry had fallen asleep on a velvet settee in the back lounge, a napkin still tucked in his collar. In the hush between dances, Genevieve slipped away to the kitchen. She took off her shoes. The tile was cool beneath her feet. The scent of thyme and roasted chestnuts still hung in the air. With her satin skirts lifted and apron tied over her gown, she spun once, slowly, then again, faster, until her hair came loose and the pins clattered to the floor like forgotten bells. She laughed, a full, open laugh that filled the space. Theodore followed moments later. He did not interrupt. He leaned against the doorframe, watching her move with a joy that defied every law of decorum. When she finally noticed him, breathless and glowing, she didn't stop. She extended a hand. He took it. They did not waltz. They simply swayed in the quiet rhythm of a room that had known struggle, recovery, rebirth. Later, after the final guest had departed, a journalist remained in the back corner, scribbling in a small leather notebook. She had been silent most of the night, watching. When asked her name, she offered only this: "People will want to read about her." Not because she was wronged, but because she rose. The next morning the column would appear. The divorcee who became a dynasty. But for now, in the upstairs salon, Genevieve stood alone before the great mirror, the one salvaged from her old drawing room. The same mirror that had shattered on the day her marriage ended. Its frame had been restored, its glass replaced with care. It no longer reflected a woman banished from Fifth Avenue. It showed a woman standing tall in a dress of her choosing, barefoot, crowned not with jewels, but with the softness of defiance, the weightlessness of a heart no longer in exile. Behind her, Theodore lit the final candle of the evening. His reflection joined hers. Their eyes met in the glass. No words passed between them. None were needed. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but inside the second table, the fire burned bright. Steadied not by matches, but by the steady hands of a woman who had once walked away from ruin and built an empire of grace in its place. New York, April of 1900. The first magnolia blossoms had begun to unfurl in Gramercy Park. Their pale petals, waxy and sweet, opened shyly toward the morning sun, just as they had each spring, since Genevieve first arrived in this quiet corner of Manhattan with nothing but a suitcase and the tremble of disgrace still on her skin. 3 years had passed since the wedding in the upstairs salon of the second table. 3 years since her name had stopped appearing in scandal columns and started gracing headlines about commerce, cuisine, and respectable rebellion. 3 years since she had stood before a mirror, once shattered, now whole, and vowed to never again vanish inside someone else's expectations. From the window of her townhouse, Genevieve watched the park gates unlock. A pair of children ran past, laughing, their wooden hoops rolling down the cobbled path. She smiled. Behind her, the soft cry of an infant stirred the room. She moved toward the bassinet slowly, not with urgency, but with reverence, the way one approaches a portrait long admired. Inside, swaddled in ivory linen, lay a sleeping girl. Violet eyes, auburn wisps, a furrowed brow that, according to Theodore, was unmistakably her mother's. They had named her Clara, not for elegance, but for clarity, for the quiet strength of a woman who had chosen to love again, not out of need, but out of fierce and conscious will. Theodore entered the room then, brushing snow from his coat, despite the early spring sun. Time had streaked his hair with silver, but his eyes still carried that same quiet awe whenever they landed on Genevieve. He kissed her temple as he passed, bending over the crib to whisper something in Latin, a phrase from a poem he used to recite before board meetings, now repurposed for lullabies. Downstairs, the second table was already opening for the day. What began as a single dining room had since expanded into a second floor, then a rooftop garden. Now there were whispers of a Boston branch, and perhaps even one in Chicago. But Genevieve no longer managed the kitchen directly. That role belonged to Marcella, the once skeptical sous chef who had become not only the restaurant's head chef, but also its most loyal champion. Alexander had returned to Charleston after recovering fully. He now ran a small wine bar near the harbor and wrote her letters with smudged ink and terrible spelling, always ending them with the same words. "Thank you for teaching me that survival is not the end of the story. It's the beginning." Aunt Louisa had passed quietly the previous autumn, just before Clara's birth. Her final days were spent seated in the parlor, embroidering a christening blanket by hand. She never finished it. Genevieve kept it folded in the baby's drawer, its edge still threaded with an unfinished rose. Harrison Lansing had vanished from public life. The collapse of his second firm was swift, and the woman he left Genevieve for later penned a memoir titled The Other One. The book was bitter, poorly written, and sold out in its first printing. He lived, it was rumored, in a rented apartment near the docks, grey-haired and ignored. Genevieve never spoke of him again. One crisp morning, a journalist from Harper's Weekly arrived to interview her. He was young, too eager, his notebook bursting with questions. How did you rebuild your name? What advice would you give to women disgraced? Do you still believe in love after everything you lost? She had listened, smiled politely, and then answered softly, "The question isn't whether love survives scandal or time. The question is whether we love ourselves enough to be loved rightly when it finally comes." Now, as she held Clara close and stepped into the warm spring light, Genevieve knew something she had not known 3 years ago. Peace does not arrive in a headline or applause. It arrives in silence, in small hands, in the steady weight of someone else's head resting on your shoulder without fear. The mirror still hung in the upstairs hallway, framed in dark walnut, lit gently by the afternoon sun. It reflected a woman no longer fleeing disgrace, but walking steadily toward legacy. Not fallen, not forgotten, simply becoming. What a journey Genevieve's story has been. From the glittering ballrooms of Fifth Avenue to the quiet defiance of a woman rebuilding her life, this tale reminds us that grace is not about never falling. It's about how we rise afterward. Genevieve taught us that dignity can bloom even after betrayal, and that love, true, steady, respectful love, will always find its way to those who dare to believe they are worthy of it. If this story moved you, if it stirred something deep in your heart, I invite you to reflect. What would you do if given a second chance, not just at love, but at life? Leave us a comment sharing your thoughts. And if you made it all the way to the end, write the word resilience in the comments below. That way, we'll know who stayed with Genevieve until the final candlelight faded and the last snow melted outside her window. You are part of this journey now. If you'd like to help keep stories like this alive, you can send a super thanks right here on YouTube, whatever amount feels right to you. It helps support the small team that brings these historical romances to life, one chapter at a time. And if you're not able to support us financially, we understand, and thank you from the bottom of our hearts for being here. Sharing this video with friends, family, or someone who loves a good emotional journey is a beautiful way to help this channel grow. Don't forget to explore more period love stories we've linked in the cards at the top. You might just discover your next favorite heroine, or a love story that feels like it was written for you. Thank you for listening. Thank you for feeling. And thank you for remembering that the past still has stories worth telling.